Welcome to Gambling with an Edge. And now, here are Bob and Richard.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Gambling with an Edge. I'm Bob Dancer.
And I'm Richard Munchkin.
Our guest today is a return visit by Professor James McManus. We're talking about his book, Cowboys Full, The History of Poker. On an earlier show, we spoke about that book, and this is a continuation. It is a book worth reading and takes more than 1 hour to talk about. So, Professor McManus, welcome back to Gambling with an Edge.
Happy to be with you.
All right. Now, I was raised in Gardena, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, and this is part of your story. Mm-hmm. Gardena had card clubs. My family frequently ate at the clubs as the food was acceptable and the prices were cheap. I played a few times when I became of age, but learned that live poker isn't my thing. How does Gardena fit into your history of poker, Jim?
Well, this was the part that I had the least direct experience with. You probably know a lot more about Gardena poker than I do. I had to rely mainly on David Hyenos' poker faces. He was, as well as talking with people who played there and learned the game, such as Mason Malmuth and David Sklansky. But Hyenos' book was a landmark because he was a trained ethnographer. He had studied a tribe in Papua New Guinea, and for his next project, he decided he was going to take on the professional gamblers in Gardena and learn everything there was to know about their code of conduct, their ways of succeeding, the games, what their life was like, and I couldn't recommend that book more strongly. It is a scholarly. It has scholarly depth, but it is extremely readable. And anyone who wants to know about what poker was like in the 60s and 70s in California, and you do yourself a favor and find this book.
You know, the other thing I thought was important, or at least in my own case, there were really no good books on poker out there. There was Herbert O. Yardley's, Oswald Jacoby had a book, but there really was not good poker literature. And in the 70s, and I think it came out before Doyle's book, a guy named John Fox wrote a book called Play Poker, Quit Work, and Sleep Till Noon. And, I was growing up in Chicago, but to me, that was the first really serious book about how to play poker, even though the games, was mostly about draw poker, which was not being played, where I was in Chicago anyway. Mm-hmm. But it was the beginning of serious poker literature, and then Doyle's book came out. So it certainly captured my imagination, this place, Gardena, because of that book.
Did you ever play there, Richard?
I did end up playing there. I moved to Los Angeles in the early 80s, and once they started dealing Hold'em, I did play there occasionally, and then once they added, these other games that were banked by players, I also was there to play those games as well. But I never went and played draw.
Yeah, this was the heyday of limit mixed games, and I think that they were able to be played there because there was a little glitch in the California Constitution, which outlawed certain versions of poker and many forms of gambling, but did allow for stud games to be played legally, and the card clubs grew up around that little niche of legality that allowed them that whereas all the other games in other parts of the town and other parts of the state were outlawed. And I think this was the first time, besides the road gamblers of Texas and Oklahoma, where the public, there were a community of players who could sit down legally in card rooms and ply their trade professionally. The road gamblers in Texas had to avoid the law. They had to beat the best players, local players. They had to avoid getting killed by the bad guys coming in to rob the games, and they had to avoid the police. Whereas a much more comfortable, relaxed, you don't have to be a bad hombre to succeed, was what the situation was in Gardena. A more civilized version of poker.
Yeah, Gardena was the first Los Angeles suburb to have poker, but I don't know the exact year, but like the Bicycle Club and several others, much bigger places, maybe 20 miles east of Gardena, grew up later.
You didn't have to pack a gun. They'd bring you quality food for free or a very low cost, as you've already pointed out, and you could sit down and ply your trade day after day, and if your edge was sufficient, you could earn a decent or a handsome living playing poker without having to worry about being arrested.
Yeah, at that time, Gardena had a different ethnic mix than it does today. In the 50s and 60s, a large percentage of the population was Japanese origin. A lot of these people had been in the concentration camps, the United States concentration camps, and so they were first-generation American Japanese. And so the card clubs reflected that. Now the Japanese areas have also moved further east and further north, but it was an interesting geographic mix. The Japanese had a gentler way of going about things than most Caucasian Americans did.
And then also the Southeast Asians started moving in. Because as my understanding is that the Japanese, there's more of a stigma against gambling in Japanese culture, whereas for the Chinese and especially the Vietnamese, there was no such stigma. That gambling and getting lucky were considered an honorable and a highly desirable thing. So that was why people from those groups, especially Vietnam, came to do so well in poker and other gambling games.
All right, let's move on to a different subject. You cover the early days of creating a computer program using artificial intelligence that would hold its own or even beat the best poker players. At the time of the book, limit poker heads up was within sight of these computers, but not quite there yet. Since then, they've claimed limit heads-up poker has been solved, and recently computers have been doing quite well in no-limit heads-up poker.
That is correct. And if you're playing limit hold'em against a reasonably well-programmed system, you're going to lose over the short, medium, and long term. The best pros in the world were dominating heads-up, no-limit hold'em for a considerable number of years. But recently, some top pros, there's no absolute agreement about who are the best no-limit hold'em players alive, but some well-thought-of professionals they were starting to play to draws, and then more recently, the programs from University of Alberta have started to beat the best pros at no limit hold'em. I think it's important to also remember in this context that chess was solved in the late 1990s by IBM's Deep Blue. So chess, and a game that everyone understands to be a tremendously complex game, was beaten earlier. The top chess players could no longer beat a computer 20 years ago, whereas it took the computers 20 years to catch up and get even with the top professionals in No Limit. And if they were playing nine-handed, I think the computers would still have a very tough time against the best players at No Limit Hold'em. So that gives a good measure of how complicated playing No Limit Hold'em well really is.
Yeah, one of the big things in poker compared to chess is totally open, and everybody can see everything, whereas in poker, there are cards face down.
Right. And there's also the luck factor. The luck factor is much harder for the computers to account for, where there's practically zero luck factor in chess.
I agree with that. Now, it's fair to assume that these computer programming are going to continue to get better, and they're going to solve six-handed No Limit and however far they go or try the other games. Yep. Now, this demands that you put out a sequel to Cowboys Full covering the history after 2008. Is that likely to happen?
That is, I would say it's 50-50 right now. The book is only 8 years old now, so I'm thinking that maybe if I'm still around 10 or 15 years after 2009, and I certainly hope to be, that a sequel might appear around 2021 or 22, something like that. But I can't make any promises, and I don't have a contract to do that yet. But I think that would be a reasonable amount of time between the end of Cowboys Full in 2009 to bring it up to, say, 2021, 2022.
All right, looking forward to that. Okay, let's talk about Andy Beal. Andy Beal is a Texas banker, a billionaire.
Math genius.
I'm sorry?
Math genius.
And genius. All right, so tell us about Andy Beal.
Andy Beal is the first amateur to take on the pros at their own game and come close to beating them, although ultimately they effectively got together and, represented by Phil Ivey, did beat him for millions and millions of dollars. And this is a guy who had conquered real estate markets, banking. He had developed his own aerospace, rocket technology. He was driven out of that business by NASA, but he also liked to gamble, and his mathematical card sense was he had a lot of brain power behind the decisions he was making in blackjack and poker. But he was very frustrated when he went out to Las Vegas because the stakes were too low for him to stimulate his interest, and the players, he felt, could gang up against him. When he got into the big games at the Bellagio, there would be 6 or 7 or 8 people playing in the big game who knew each other and had been playing together for decades, and he didn't think that he could get a fair shot against them. Also, he preferred limit games to no-limit games. Long story short, he negotiates a deal in which they're playing. He wants to take the pros out of their comfort zone by raising the stakes tremendously high, so high that none of them would have a bankroll by himself or herself. The only woman playing on that team was Jennifer Harmon, so that they had to pool their resources and play against him as tag teams. He would play one-on-one against the top players for $10 million freeze-outs in limit hold'em, $20 million. They eventually played $25 million freeze-outs. And over the years, he was playing fairly even with them. This is beginning around 2002. For the next 10, 12 years, there would be games in which he would pull ahead by several $1 million, and eventually he was growing frustrated because he always had to play on the road, even though he could get a suite at any Vegas hotel and have a nice mattress. He felt that he was at a disadvantage because the pros, such as Chip Reese, Jennifer Harmon, Howard Lederer, were able to go home that night and sleep in their own beds, and he didn't sleep as well when he was away from his own bed and his family. And he pressed them harder and harder to come down and play in Dallas, where he still lives. And they resisted that for a variety of reasons. One, they liked home court advantage, and two, the legality. Since playing poker for high stakes or any stakes in Texas, the irony being Texas Hold'em is illegal in Texas. They needed, they kept resisting his insistence. So the game would break up. I was covering the game for the New Yorker for a while, but the long lapses between games in which they could agree on the location and the stakes were such that article never came to fruition. But a great book about the game called The Professor, the Banker, and the Suicide King by Michael Craig comes out. Michael Craig. And the people who want to, I've got 3 chapters about the game in my book, but Mike Craig's book also goes into even greater detail about how that game developed, when it started, when it stopped, it restarted, who was playing. So it was ultimately what happened is that Phil Ivey sat down against Beal for playing tremendously high stakes, 25,000 blinds of 25,000 and 50,000, and this took place at the Wynn, and Ivey went on a heater. He's also arguably the greatest poker player around these days. He beat Andy for tens of millions of dollars, and since then, I don't think the game has been played.
Couple things. First, on Michael Craig, he was on our show on March 6, 2015. So any of our listeners who are more interested in the Andy Beal story can certainly pick up that podcast. And secondly, I'm pretty sure Andy Beal has been back to Vegas within the last year, and Todd Brunson took him to the cleaners on this last trip.
I was not aware of that. I know Todd a little, so I'm going to get in touch with him about that. Was it covered in any of the poker press?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure Card Player had it after the fact. But
yeah, those games are naturally secretive. They're held. There's not a lot of reporters around. But I will dive into that coverage as soon as we're done with this interview.
So actually, a story that I've told on the air before, but I have a couple of friends who actually solved Limit Hold'em 10 or 15 years before the guys in Ottawa, and rather than publish, they used it to make tens of millions of dollars.
Right.
They contacted Andy Beal and said, look, we can teach you to play Game Theory Optimal, which will make you unbeatable. And he said, well, talk to this guy. He's my math PhD. And they talked to the math PhD, and the guy said, well, that's impossible. You couldn't possibly have beat the game of Limit Hold'em, and blew them off, basically. So quite a missed opportunity.
Yeah, the word solves, like Mike Caro and his colleagues, but Mike was the center of it, was reputed to have completely solved 5-card draw, jacks or better. And exactly what that means, does that mean he could never lose in 5-card draw? Certainly he was one of the very top players. I don't know that a game can ever be completely solved. A poker variant can never be completely solved because the luck factor is so significant.
Well, yes, there's luck, but if you're playing game theory optimal, it means that you are making the optimal play, and in the long run you must win, unless they also are playing game theory optimal, in which case you would ultimately break even.
Right. But at that, and your point is very well taken. At the same time, what is the long run? In the long run, does that mean over a year? Does that mean over 10 years? Does it mean over 6 months? And let's say it's 6 months, where the game theory optimal strategy is going to definitely win. If the cards run against you before your bankroll, to the point where your bankroll disappears, even if you would have dominated after 6 months or a year or more, and more certainly after 2 or 3 or 4 years, poker has a way, the variance has a way of defeating, in my experience and from my conversations with a lot of people, so people have good days, the biological aspects of poker. Doyle or even Todd at a certain point can't, you're not at your optimal experience. If Todd is chugging Red Bulls because the game was supposed to start at 10 o'clock in the morning, Beal likes to play early in the day. Todd is a hard partying guy. There's other factors besides a perfect quote unquote strategy. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that there are terms such as the long run that we don't actually know exactly what that means.
Well, right, because the long run changes depending on the difference in your edge. If you're only playing 1% better than him, it could take a year for you to grind out a win. Right. But if you're playing 10% better than him, well, you're going to be ahead, in not a very long time.
And even if you're say you have a 5% edge, and that more or less theoretically guarantees that you're going to be ahead after 6 months. If you run bad for the first month or two, you could be out of the game by then. That is a mistake that non-professional gamblers make, which is, you have to bet within your bankroll, and there's the Kelly criteria, which tells you how much you're allowed to bet, and that was one of Beal's strategy, was to try to get them to overbet their bankroll. So you're right. Yes.
People were sweating blood when they were down $5 million to him.
Right. And when you're sweating that much, at one point he had almost wiped out the entire the bankroll of the top tier, the top 10 players in Vegas. He had taken tens of millions of dollars out of the economy just by running good and playing well for a few months.
Yeah,
I think that theoretically, who's going to win theoretically is so often doesn't describe who actually won, because of all the human factors and the fear factor, the tiredness factor, which is also goes back to the strongest reasons that you don't want to play against bots or online when you might be up against a bot, because you never know if somebody has got an absolutely unbeatable edge, or something has an absolutely unbeatable edge.
Everything you say is true, and our show primarily is to an audience of people who are actively trying to beat some sort of casino game. long term, and we need to
Right.
fade these things. We need to take them into consideration. And there are a number of us who've been very successful over the years, but there are no guarantees. Let's move on.
That's all I was saying.
Okay, and we have no argument with that.
Richard knows a lot more about this than I do. I'm not a theory intensive person. I'm more interested in the stories of what happens to the players, who won, who lost, when, and what the cultural implications are. You know, why the United States has had so many presidents and generals and Supreme Court justices who love the game and play it avidly, and yet it remains illegal in our country. I just think that's more my bailiwick than perfect game theoretical perfection. I just have to bow to people with vastly more expertise than I have on those subjects.
Very good, and we do appreciate what you bring to the table, and we're definitely going to be talking about these pokertitions in the near future. Let's go to online poker. Now, while it was alive and well, how is playing online poker different than playing in regular casinos and card rooms?
Well, for people like me who didn't live in Las Vegas or Los Angeles, I live in the poker desert of Chicago, where I have to leave. When I play medium stakes or higher stakes tournaments, I have to go to either Indiana or Milwaukee. Illinois is a terrible place to play poker, whereas during the years that I was playing online, basically 2005 through 2011, I could get up and walk down to my office, and I was sponsored by one of the sites, Full Tilt, and I was paid to play, and I could play whenever I wanted. I didn't have to drive anywhere. All the expenses of getting to and from poker games disappeared. And at the time, I believed that I was playing, that the deals were random, and that the games were safeguarded against, there was cheating was not possible, or would be made to be as unlikely as they could. And it was a tremendous boon. Many thousands of people were making handsome livings playing poker online with very little effort besides their poker skill. Since then, we have learned that bots can be involved, that you could be playing even a $1, $2 game against at least one pro, and in many games, even six-handed games against 4 or 5 pros. And as people got better and better at figuring out who their competition was, I think that's when a lot of people began to drop out of online poker even before the American government shut it down after Bush signed the UIGEA into law, and it was enforced by Preet Bharara in 2011.
I think it also was a quantum leap in the caliber of play, because people could play so many more hands per hour,
right.
and gain so much experience in a much shorter time.
Yep. That's why in a very short amount of time, in 2003, when so many people, including Chris Moneymaker in 2003 and Greg Raymer in 2004, the 2 straight world champions, won their buy-in to the $10,000 bet in online satellites. People flooded into the game, and it was, there was more and more incentive to play well, because you could win so much. Your edge could be deployed over 6 or 8 or 10, or sometimes I've heard even 20 games at a time. Hard to imagine how somebody could play well on 20 tables, but I've heard that they could do it. And the skill factor, we used to mock players, not me, but at the table you would hear people, when people would make a bad play, they would be described as an internet player. And 2 or 3 years after that, the internet-trained players had started dominating the game. In order to build up experience in high-skill, high-stakes no-limit hold'em, it used to take 10 or 15 years on the road. You could play that many hands in a semester in a dorm room, so that these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids had more experience at various no-limit hold'em situations than it took the previous generation or two a decade to learn. It was an amazing period. Go ahead.
Yeah, things changed very, very quickly. Another thing I think is that the online play itself, to me, became almost a different game because there were using software that gave you statistics about your opponents and how many times they call the flop and how many times they raise, and it really became a different game than what you would play in a live poker room.
Right. You could bum hunt. You could find weak players, and you could refuse to play anybody who had a strong statistical profile. So obviously, that wiped out a lot of bankrolls in a hurry, and gradually, only the very best players were playing games anything bigger than $1, $2.
And even the $1, $2 games are so much stronger than the games you would find in a casino at those stakes.
Exactly. Which, of course, leads back to the version of the game that most of us, people our age, grew up with, which is live poker, where you're playing against a person, usually a guy, who's tired, not tired, sober, drunk. He's been playing for 2 hours or 22 hours, and all of those factors, plus the opportunities to evaluate the strength of their hand based on physical information. All of that is now at a much higher premium than it was during the online period, in which you were just playing making more mathematical decisions as opposed to personal decisions.
And hiding, of course, that information from people using those tells on yourself.
Yep. And that's the version of the game that I prefer. I do miss online poker. Yeah, but I think the live version is more real. That you know who you're up against, or you don't. But there's the opportunities to misrepresent yourself are much smaller, and you know that they're not sitting there with a program. They may have the algorithms in their head, and that's what we now call poker skill, as opposed to cheating skill. They know what to do in various situations. The more information they get about you, their opponent, the more opportunities they have to fine tune what they're doing, and you have those same opportunities yourself.
Do you prefer playing tournaments or cash games?
I play bigger. I play for more money in tournaments. For me, the tournament game is more. I've had better luck in tournaments, and also since I make my living writing, not only about poker, but to a great extent, I make my living writing about poker. And the tournament, when you do well, all of your results, plus or minus, are out there in the world. And there's so much more focus, public focus on tournaments, because live cash games are by definition private affairs, even if they're taking place in a casino. So the opportunities for publicity, the sequence of me doing well in the 2000 World Series, to writing a book, to getting sponsorship, to writing another book, all of that process was triggered by a tournament in a way that, like, doing well in a cash game for 4 days never could have yielded the positive results that they yielded for me.
Sure.
UIGEA.
So when I play cash, I play more friendly cash games, and I play in higher, medium stakes poker tournaments. What used to be higher stakes tournaments, $10,000, are now medium or even smallish games. And I can't afford to play in the high rollers.
Right.
You can afford the entry fee, but the return would be very, very low.
Yeah.
Well, of course.
I also like the positive opportunities. You know, you can't turn $10,000 into, in a cash game, you can't turn that into $1 million or $5 million in a tournament. That's more exciting to me. I've never tried to make my living or support my family playing poker. I do that as a teacher and a writer. Poker's more of a hobby.
Yeah, we're going to talk about how your wife fits into your poker stuff more when we go on to Positively Fifth Street. She's a major character in the background in that book. Now, the UIGEA put a damper on internet poker. Many online casinos stopped taking American players, but a few continued, including Full Tilt and PokerStars. A few years after your book was published, Black Friday brought some federal indictments against these casinos, and some prominent players in your book, Howard Lederer and Chris Ferguson, became loathed by the poker communities. That's another good reason for you to write a sequel.
Right.
What does your crystal ball tells you about the future of internet poker in the United States?
My crystal ball is cloudy because it's not something that I focus a lot on. I thought I played online and I wrote about the experience much more 8, 9, 10 years ago. Now I almost never play online. My crystal ball is not likely to be accurate, but I'll tell you what my sense is that as the algorithms and the bots become more sophisticated, unless the sites can figure out foolproof ways to identify them and keep them off, that fewer people will be willing to play for interesting stakes online. On the other hand, it continues to amaze me that American politicians don't license and tax online poker, because the opportunities are considerable, and that poker is clearly a game of skill, unlike some of the other games that people have been over the years been able to play online. So I'm, as an American, as a person who understands how intricately woven poker is into our culture almost from the very beginning, it offends me that American lawmakers have made playing poker illegal, and that they compare it to bingo or blackjack, which are games that which are not skill games, in my opinion. Although there are varieties of blackjack, there are versions of blackjack in which your skill level and your strategy can make you a winner.
Well, I'm with you on bingo. On this show, we think blackjack is definitely a game of skill.
Well, where can you find a game, a blackjack, where you have a serious edge, where the casino's edge is 0 or less?
Oh, they're out there, but that's a show for another day. But there are definitely many people still making a living at blackjack.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that. I'm much more familiar with the number of people who make a living playing poker is considerable, but I think it's gone down now that people can't play online. But I'm not privy to who's making how many people are making a living in Southeast Asia, China, and so on. I think that's the next big poker boom, online and or live, will depend on what the Chinese government allows their people to do. If online poker became legal in China, it would be there'd be a massive boom. And if Chinese poker players, there's a tournament going on in Macau right now, and as more and more Chinese people have access, have money, and they get a taste for American-style poker, that could just change the game more dramatically than anything that's happened in the States.
Absolutely.
Poker booms outside the United States much more. Poker's in a lull in America right now for a variety of reasons, but in the rest of the world, especially in the Pacific Rim and Europe, poker's booming.
All right. We've been talking to Jim McManus, author of the book Cowboys Full, The History of Poker. We're going to take a brief break for commercials, and when we come back, we're going to talk to him about the first chapter in his book, which we're going to make the last question on our show. The South Point has more than 10,000 games, returning more than 99%. This is more than anyone else has. By the time this show is posted, it's too late to earn any more of April's free buffets on Mondays through Thursdays. If you have any unredeemed vouchers for this, they may be used through May 4th. From May 1st to 25th, Monday through Thursday, you may play in the $500,000 Swipe, Spin, and Win game. Play 300 points between 3 a.m. and 11 p.m. and spin the wheel at the kiosk to get your prize. One prize per day. Prizes include free play, cash, resort gift cards, and food coupons. On Memorial Day, Monday, May 29th, there will be 2 times points for video poker all day long and bigger multipliers on reels. No limits, no machines excluded. At videopoker.com, it's the best place to play lots of games. If you sign up for the Gold membership, $8.95 a month or $79.95 a year, this allows you to get corrections on most of the games. The game of the week is 50 play with Quick Quads. I've spoken about Quick Quads numerous times on the show, and personally, it's at the top of my list for fun video poker games. I've never seen a good pay schedule in the 50 play version of Quick Quads. I look forward to the day when I find such a machine. Okay, on the first chapter of the book, you call it Pokerticians, and you talk about presidents who are good poker players, and the list of good poker players among presidents is considerable.
Right.
One of Nixon's biographers, whatever you think of Nixon, made the case that anybody who could not hold his own in a first-class poker game had no business being president of the United States.
Poker skill was not tantamount, but it was associated with being a man of the world. And some of those reasons, for a variety of reasons, some of which were entirely valid. You needed to be able to size up your opponent. You needed to have courage. You needed to have tactical and strategic intelligence. And you had to be lucky. And those things were highly valued by men and increasingly by women. But back in the days that Eisenhower and Nixon were playing, those were not identical, but closely associated with the kinds of skills that it took to be a man of the world. One of the most interesting aspects of poker history is how the 2 presidents who played for the highest stakes in their lives, Nixon and Eisenhower, both refused to discuss it on the campaign trail because they thought it was, they realized that too many people, potential voters, would think it was an immoral thing for them to have done. That poker still had that stench of the cheating days, so that even though these 2 men had supported themselves, Eisenhower earning enough money to date the wealthy debutante Mamie Dowd before World War One, and Nixon earning enough money in the Navy during World War II in order to run for Congress. They played for serious stakes while they were in the Army. Nixon was in the Navy, and afterwards, that they disavowed their interest in and success at that game because they thought it would cost them votes.
Well, after Eisenhower came Kennedy, and on both sides, both Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, poker skills came into play. What do you remember about that?
Well, it was one of a classic example of one gambler, one bluffer sizing up another. And Khrushchev was the Soviet premier in the 50s and early 60s, had sized up Kennedy, who was after all a very, very young man when he became president. And he had noted that Kennedy had organized a botched invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and he wanted to test him. And he furthered, and he arranged with Castro to put Soviet missiles onto Cuba 90 miles from the United States, assuming that Kennedy wouldn't be able to stand up to him on the diplomatic stage. And when when American spy planes saw that the Russians were putting in these launchers, Kennedy reacted in a way that surprised Khrushchev, and they faced each other down over. Kennedy decided to blockade the island of Cuba, and said, "You're not going to put missiles here. You're going to take these bases down." And Khrushchev sent Soviet supply ships to break the blockade, and both sides were threatening to go to war with each other, and both sides had hundreds and hundreds of nuclear-tipped missiles. So in October of 1962, the world was very close to being. There was going to be a major nuclear exchange, which would have killed tens or hundreds of millions of people, and perhaps even made the Earth's atmosphere uninhabitable. And it was Kennedy's bluff that he would, in fact, launch, and he gave Khrushchev to believe that he would launch missiles by putting our bombers on highest alert over a radio frequency that he knew the Russians were tuned into. And when the Russians heard that our bombers were at the last stage of preparedness before they attacked, Khrushchev backed down, and he basically folded his hand. Kennedy bluffed him. Khrushchev, not wanting to risk the annihilation of tens or hundreds of millions of human beings, made what the poker writer Aaron Brown has called a nice laydown, saving the world from a nuclear conflagration.
In today's headlines, we have Putin and Trump playing poker over Syria, perhaps.
Yeah, and Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
Whatever side of the political spectrum you are with Trump, he is the leader of the country, and if he loses one of these poker games, we all lose.
Yeah.
It's pretty scary stuff.
Well, people have been threatening each other with military force, humans, armies, for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years probably, if you go back to the tribal stuff. And sometimes those threatened battles, those bluffs, turned out not to be bluffs, and one side or another was annihilated. But the earth went on from that. This tribe was annihilated, and the guys from across the river won, and they got the territory, and they got the crops, and they got the beautiful women, Whereas today, if there's a major battle, the nuclear winter will set in, and there will be the human race will effectively be over. We won't have people in outer space to repopulate on other planets. It will just be over. And not that everyone would die in the initial strike, but if dozens or hundreds of these missiles were fired in one direction or another, the environment would not tolerate it, and the planet would become uninhabitable. Given how much bigger these bombs are compared to the Hiroshima bomb, they're 1,500 times more powerful. So, as Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump and Putin, and to a lesser extent the Chinese, are threatening one another in one part of the planet or of the Earth or another, we really have to hope that that cooler heads prevail before the codes are brought out and the missiles start flying.
Scary stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Jim McManus. We've spent 2 separate shows talking about your Cowboys full history of poker. In the near future, we're also going to get you back and talk about your Positively Fifth Street, which is about the 2000
That's a funner
main
book.
event.
Yeah.
It is. So actually, what's surprising to me is I read the books back to back, and then even your short stories back to back.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of passages which are similar between all 2 books or all 3 books.
Yeah.
Which was curious.
I borrow from myself from time to time.
Yeah, well, you don't always give yourself credit, but I suppose you're not going to sue yourself for that, so it's not called plagiarism. This has been fun. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it. Both of you guys, thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard. Go out and hit royal flushes, everybody. Good day.